All right, thank you. Can you hear me in the back okay? Like that? Okay, excellent. Yeah, well, thank you, John. Thank you for having me here. It's always great to get on campus. I'm based at the State Water Survey, which is all the way south of the arena. So it's good to get on campus and get lost in the building, so it's fun. Today, I'm going to talk about climate change from lots of different perspectives. One is what's happening. The other is why it matters, as in the impacts. And the last is what you all can do about it. I'm not an architect. I'm a climatologist, so I'm going to touch superficially upon these sorts of things like sustainable development, design, and then subsequent speakers in this lecture series are going to drill down into those things in a hopefully really interesting way. My apologies to those of you who are not from Illinois. Can I have a show of hands? How many of you are from Illinois? Oh, well then never mind. No. This is good. Lots of people from Illinois, but there's a lot of people who aren't from Illinois. I'm the Illinois State climatologist, so a lot of my work deals with climate variability, climate change, and its impacts in Illinois. There is a giant elephant in the room that I will not tackle in this talk, and that is sea level rise. But I'm going to leave enough time to talk about those sorts of issues. So if you're somebody who works or wants to work in an area that sea level rise is going to be a dominant factor, which is pretty much any of the coasts, especially some of the areas like the East Coast of the U.S., we can talk about that too. But I'm going to focus here to start with on Illinois. All right, so when we talk about climate change, a lot of folks think about that means the atmosphere. And the atmosphere is part of the climate system, but we argue also that the climate system includes all of the features you see here. This is kind of the natural climate system. We have parts of the sun, which of course the sun drives all of our weather here on Earth. We have the atmosphere, we have the land and everything on it. We have the hydrosphere, all of our water. We have the cryosphere, all of our ice. We have the lithosphere, parts of the soil, and the biosphere, all of our plants. And then the anthrosphere, which is us and everything that we interact with, which is pretty much everything. What this means is, in all these complicated arrows, is that any change in any of these components can change any of the other components. And what we've seen over the last 150 years is massive change in one component of this climate system, and that is atmospheric chemistry that's changed pretty much every other component here. Okay. And this is what we see. What the plot here on the right-hand side is showing is atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations going back from Mauna Loa, our observatory there in Hawaii, going back to the late 1950s all the way to the present. And we can see this undeniable increase in, carbon dioxide concentrations in parts per million. When we started this record back in the late 50s, we were at something like 318, 315 parts per million. As you can see there on the left-hand side, the latest measurement is 415 parts per million. Now, to put that in context, when we look at direct measurements of carbon dioxide concentration going back over the last 800,000 years from ice cores in Antarctica, what we see is that previous to the Industrial Revolution, about 1850, we had never gotten over about 300 parts per million, at least in the last 800,000 years. And we've seen a rise from about that level to where we're at now in just a 70-year period. So, a couple of things here. Observed consistent increase in carbon dioxide concentrations over those last 65 years. Now, with or without humans, what we know is that the dominant driver of atmospheric variability and temperature here on Earth, so increasing carbon dioxide concentration. What we know from, all of Earth's history is that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is the dominant driver of atmospheric temperature on Earth, and that's with or without humans. As carbon dioxide goes up, temperature goes up, carbon dioxide goes down, temperature goes down. So, as we expect, when I click on this slide, I'm going to switch order here. As we expect, what we've seen over the last 150 years is an increase in carbon dioxide concentrations, is an increase in the global average temperature. That's what these 5 different data set lines are showing here. An increase in global average temperature since 1850. This is global warming. Global warming is not climate change. Global warming causes climate change. It is the root cause of climate change. And this is the only time that we're going to talk about global warming, because this increase of about 1 degree Celsius relative to pre-industrial levels is not all that impactful in and of itself. What's impactful is the fact that this degree Celsius increase over the last 150 years represents a tremendous change in energy balance here on Earth, because it takes a lot of energy to change the entire Earth's global average temperature by a degree Celsius. And so that change in energy balance disrupts that complex climate system that I talked about before, and that's what climate change is. Importantly here, bottom line, human activities, this is from an Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, IPCC, just released earlier this year. Human activities have caused virtually all this warming since the 1850s. And the dominant drivers of that are kind of what you see here. So this pie chart is the sources, essentially, of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas emissions in aggregate, just in the U.S. in 2019. We don't use the 2020 data because, of course, it's not representative of anything we've done in the past 40, 50, 120 years. But what you can see here is that the emissions from transportation, electricity generation, industrial processes, commercial, residential, and agriculture. Now, design, and particularly architectural design, touches a lot of these things. And we're going to talk about that towards the end of the talk. But basically, this is just to demonstrate that we as humans over the last 150 years have had significant impact on our climate system. So what has this meant, right? What has global warming meant for Illinois? And indeed, if we talk about any other global region, it could be a little bit different. Right? I was listening to a story on the radio when I was driving here that was talking about agriculture in the desert Southwest, in the Southwest U.S., or what's left of agriculture there. It's a much different outlook than it is here. So, no, you're good. We're going to talk about first temperature. So, letting the cat out of the bag right off the bat here, we are getting warmer in Illinois. What you can see here on the right-hand side is county by county and season by season temperature trends since 1895. Every single season in Illinois has gotten warmer, but as you can see here, winter and spring have warmed at a much larger extent than summer and fall have. This is important in a couple different ways. First of all, what that's meant is we've had a significant decrease in the number of very cold nights, or nights where we get below freezing, especially in the wintertime. That has all sorts of ecological impacts, and we won't really get to those here, but what it's meant is it's making a more suitable environment for things, other types of non-native invasive species of plants and animals to make their way up from south. What we've also seen is that in the summertime, although this rate of average temperature change here, county by county, the whites are indicating not much temperature warming, not much temperature change over the last 150 years, but that's average temperature. When we break it down to daily minimum temperature or low temperature and daily high temperature, our nighttime low temperatures have increased at about 2 to 4 times the rate of our daytime high temperatures in the summertime. What this has meant is, and I'll show projections of this in a little bit, our summer nights have gotten a lot warmer. And so what we're not seeing anymore is the number of cooler nights in the summertime. There's significant health implications from that when we think about it. Every time I click on the slide, these things come on. There. Okay. This is what I was talking about. So what the plot on the top right-hand side is showing is annual number of cool nights, what I'm calling cool nights in Chicago. And this is the number of nights in July where our nighttime temperature gets below 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay? My apologies for not using metric as Celsius units here. Fahrenheit's better, and it is the only metric system that's better. Okay, to put it in terms that a really scientist that I respect a lot told me is that Celsius is what water feels, Fahrenheit is what humans feel. So we're going to talk about Fahrenheit here. So 55 degrees Fahrenheit, and that I call those cool nights because 55 degrees is that threshold where below that I got to put on a jacket, but above that is shorts and short sleeves. And it's my index, so I can name that. Anyway, 55 degrees is my minimum temperature here. What you can see going all the way back at O'Hare since the 1950s, really the 1960s, 70s, even the 80s, these cool nights in July were a regular thing in the city of Chicago. We normally get anywhere between 3 and upwards of 9 to 12 of these nights per season, per July. But you can see that they began to get much more infrequent in the 1990s, 2000s, 2010, and the last time we had a July nighttime temperature below 55 degrees at Chicago O'Hare Airport was in 2016. And so this is the thing is that with an increase in nighttime temperatures in the summertime, what that does is it makes it so it's a lot less likely that people can cool down at night. So yes, if we see a 90, 95 degree daytime high temperature for those who either don't have air conditioning or can't run their air conditioning, they do build up that heat stress, significant health implication. But if you can get cool enough at night where you can open your window or go outside and recover from that, you have much less health implications from that. these nighttime temperatures, increasing nighttime temperatures, are really causing a problem with that. When it comes from industrial design, the main driver of these nighttime temperatures is what you're seeing in the bottom plot here, increases in humidity. This is showing the record from Springfield, which is our state capital, for those of you who don't know Illinois. But it's pretty much the same everywhere around. This is showing us the change in the average summertime dew point temperature. Dew point's a really good indication of humidity, much better than relative humidity, especially when it comes to implications on humans. The reason being is that your dew point temperature takes into account air temperature and humidity. And when you get a dew point temperature above about 60 degrees, that's when we Midwesterners start to kind of feel the humidity. Above 65, it starts to feel kind of sticky, and above 70, that's just downright oppressive. Okay, so what you can see here is the average, not the maximum amount of humidity, but the average summertime humidity in Springfield has increased since the 1950s, around 64, 65 degrees. Yeah, Springfield's humid, but it's not too bad. All the way up to now we're at 66, 67 degrees. And again, that's the average, averaging over all the dew points in the summertime. So what we're seeing is an increase in significant summertime humidity. The thing about dew point is that if your dew point temperature is 70 degrees, your dew point is just your air temperature when the air is saturated. Okay? And so what that means is if your dew point temperature at midnight is 70 degrees, your nighttime temperature ain't getting below 70 degrees. That's the way it goes. Otherwise, the air temperature cools to your dew point. Guess what? You have dew on the ground, which is why it's called the dew point. So what that means is an increase in background humidity increases our nighttime temperatures. And by the way, when it's very, very humid at night during the summertime, it also makes it a lot harder to cool down when you've built up a lot of energy during the daytime. Interesting, real quick story here. This probably will push me over time, but if anybody's familiar with SIU, the Southern Illinois University, they have in Feiner Hall, big, ugly, long hall. Anyway, that was where I was before when I was here. They have the museum there, and they have 4 Warhol paintings, but they can't hang said Warhol paintings. Anybody know why? Of course you don't know why, because you didn't go to SIU. The reason is that they took a design, an architectural design of the building to make that big building from New Mexico State. An architectural firm made the design for New Mexico State and said, here you go. New Mexico State said, no, we don't want it. SIU said, hey, we'll take that for cheaper. And then they just plopped it in the middle of Carbondale without considering differences in humidity. So what ended up happening is the humidity doesn't get below about 50% during the summertime. And you can't hang your priceless paintings. So, anyway, this does matter. As we see increases in humidity, of course, it's not just humans that suffer, but our interiors as well. All right, so what do model projections say about temperature? It's mainly much the same. Continued warming. These are model projections, taking our climate models, projecting them out to the future. This is what we expect. This is probably most pertinent for your work because the building doesn't have a 5-year lifetime, it has a 100-year lifetime. So continued warming in all seasons, largest in winter, but really importantly, as we continue to warm, the projections of these temperature extremes also increase. On the left, this plot is showing your annual number of very warm nights. That's when your nighttime temperature doesn't get below 70 degrees Fahrenheit, so very warm. The right plot is the annual number of very hot days. It's for the whole state of Illinois, which hot days is 95-degree Fahrenheit day. What you can see is this consistent increase. The red and the green is a projected increase out to 2100 of both very warm nights and very hot days relative to the baseline, which is your black line there. To put this in perspective, the green area here is showing the projections under a moderate emission scenario. Okay, if we cut carbon dioxide emissions now, get net zero, and I'll explain that in a second, by 2050, and then decrease from there, that's where we're at with the green, the moderate emission scenario. The red is a higher emission scenario, essentially not cut business as usual, but keep going the way we've been going. That's that. And so what this is showing you is a couple of things here. First of all, we see this kind of bifurcation between the moderate and high emission scenario. That is showing the impact of mitigation. Reducing or eliminating carbon dioxide greenhouse gas emissions. What the models are saying is if we do that, the quicker we do that, the less warming we have, the fewer extreme hot days and warm nights we have. So temperature impacts and extreme temperatures are very sensitive to emissions now to about mid-century. Okay? That's important applying what I talked about towards the end, what the things we can do. However, on the other side of this, even under the moderate emission scenario, when we consider the spread of the models, what the projections are telling us is that by 2050, they're projecting an increase from about 10 warm nights per year, that's nights when we don't get below 70 degrees, up to anywhere between 25 and 50. And that's under the moderate emission scenario. That's if we take action. So imagine an additional month of nights where we don't get below 70 degrees. That's significant. Combined with that, an additional anywhere between 15 and 60 days when we get above 95 degrees. Now we're talking some real significant heat impacts. So again, two real takeaway points here from these plots is that part of the change in the increasing in temperature extremes is baked into the system, but they are also sensitive to what we do from between now and 2050 as far as mitigating our greenhouse gas emissions. All right, I'm switching gears to precipitation now. This plot is showing annual precipitation statewide, and the blue year to year, and then the red is like a 10-year moving average. You can see Illinois has gotten wet over the last 150 years, about 5 inches wetter on average. And so what that is indicating, we're just getting wetter overall. Most places in the Midwest are. Now the thing is if we were to take 5 inches, or 12.5 centimeters, and divvy it up among all the months equally, it wouldn't be that big a deal. We wouldn't see that big of an impact. The problem is that what we've seen in the Midwest, and in Illinois in particular, is that it's not just rain that's increased, it's not just conditions that have gotten wetter, but the intensity of rain has increased. All right, these kind of lists on the right-hand side. Since I took over as state climatologist, really since the pandemic, what I've done is try to keep track of all the really intense rainfall events all across the state. And what we can see is a couple things. My list is getting so long it no longer fits on my slide. All right, and I've updated us from if any of you are from the north side of Chicago, you got this event here, right, that messed up the Bears game. Actually, probably gave them the win, but still. And then what we also see is that it's hard to get away from these intense rainfall events. Many communities have been significantly affected by this. I want to note the one in August 2021 in Gibson City, which is about 30 miles north of here. They had 11.5 inches of rain in about 3 hours. The only reason it wasn't more than that is because the guy who was measuring it had a manual rain gauge that only held 11.5 inches. And when he got out there, it was spilling out of the rain gauge. So it's possible he got 12, 13, 14 inches of rain. We don't know. All right. If we kept track of hourly records, that would have easily surpassed the 3-hour rainfall record for Illinois and possibly gotten close to a national record. It was an absolutely insane event. I've never seen flame like that. I hope I never see it again. But unfortunately, what the models are telling us, we probably will. This picture here, this bends underwater and this overpass, that was from a couple Sundays ago in Chicago, where we got 4.5 inches in 3 hours. All right. To put some numbers to this, because we all like numbers. The annual exceedance probability, right? That's your 100-year storm, your 500-year storm. I don't like using those terms because a 100-year storm doesn't happen once every 100 years. It has a 1% chance of happening any given year. Really important there. Your annual exceedance probability, the probability that you get this much rain in this period of time, for a 4.5-inch rainfall event in 24 hours increased from 10% to 20% just in the last 30 years in the city of Chicago. So I go to a Chicago planner or manager, this mayor, the mayor's going to sit down with me. And I'm going to say, Mayor, you had a 10% chance of getting 4.5 inches of rain, right, in a 24-hour period. You get 4.5 inches of rain in a 24-hour period, the Chicago River floods, you get sewage into Lake Michigan, bad things happen. That has a 10% chance of happening any given year. Plan accordingly. Because of changing rainfall rates, now that chance has doubled to 20%, right? So when we think about what happened in 1989, right, when we first estimated those recurrence intervals, a lot of the infrastructure of our towns and cities weren't even built to that standard. Now we're talking about the probability of those events that would cause significant flooding doubling in just a 30-year period. What we're doing right now is going back in retrospect and looking at projections of what these numbers are going to look like by 2050, because again, if people are putting in subdivisions, development, they have to think about what numbers they're going for of how much rain they're going to see. So significant increases in intense rain is a real problem across the state of Illinois. And I'll get into some social economic impacts here in just a little bit from those. As far as projections, models project a continuation of these trends. The maps on the right-hand side show projected changes in total annual precipitation. The blues, the greens, especially in winter and spring, are indicating wetter overall conditions, and then a bit of variability in summer and fall. So essentially what models are projecting is a continued wetting trend, again, particularly in winter and spring. So basically all of these kind of changes in Illinois' climate that I've just kind of laid out for you in probably more detail than you wanted are likely to continue, if not accelerate. Some of them are sensitive to actions now to the end of the century. Some of them aren't so sensitive to that. So what this is telling us is that as solutions, we need to think about mitigation, actually fixing the problem of climate change, and adaptation, adapting to kind of these new changing frequencies of high impact events. All right, so thinking about actual impacts of climate change, where the rubber meets the road. I'm going to talk about public health first and foremost and kind of relate a lot of this back to public health. It is my, argument, I suppose, that climate change, the kind of ideas of climate change and trying to get people behind this idea, this is something we need to fix, we need to work on, is, I think, one, are lost in the realm of public health. Because not everybody's a farmer, not everybody owns their own business, not everybody's an architect or a sustainable design manager, but everybody has health. Okay, so everybody can kind of understand the public health implications. And the impacts from climate change on public health are diverse and they are many. So this is just one example of them taking from the BRACE program at University of Illinois Chicago's examples. We have higher risk of heat-related illness. I talked about that a little bit when we think about our warmer nights, our hotter days, and I'll get into more detail about that in just a second. Worsening allergy. How many of you suffer from allergies? Yeah, that allergy season, yeah, that's a joke, right? I'm taking Zyrtec now from early March all the way to late November, pretty much. I think I keep that corporation afloat, just myself, right? Worsening allergy and respiratory conditions because of an increased allergy season. Increasing risk of exposure to vector-borne disease. Mosquitoes are one of those, but ticks are sort of the underestimated vector there when it comes to disease. We have our kind of diseases we're familiar with, like Lyme and Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and then we have these emerging diseases like alpha-gal, for example, syndrome, which is gives you an allergy to mammalian meat. We also have issues with worsening air quality, higher ozone concentrations, and then importantly, and I'll stress this point in a second, the impacts of climate change. So climate change, what it does is it changes the frequency of the hazard. More heat waves, more flooding, more extreme rainfall, things like that. But what it also does is through that change in the hazard, it exacerbates existing inequalities in our social systems. All right, so it's not just that we have more heat waves, so everybody suffers equally. No, the same people who already disproportionately have the largest impacts from our hazards get even more of those impacts. And it's kind of a crappy double-edged sword. Those folks are also the least, or actually say the most vulnerable, have the least resources to deal with those impacts. So I call them divested communities, even within the same city, as I'll show in a second, are the most vulnerable to these impacts. All right, case in point here. Thinking about extreme heat as a hazard, all right? Zoom just really wants me to have these floating meeting panels. There we go, okay. All right, so extreme heat and thinking about the hazard and the vulnerability, okay? Now the plot on the top left here, these are those same kind of projection plots that I showed you before. This is projecting out the hottest 5-day temperatures. You take 5 consecutive days in the summertime, what's your hottest average temperature? Showing an increase, a significant increase for the northern part of our state. All right? Now these two maps are saying, okay, if we take that idea that heat and heat waves are increasing everywhere in Illinois, what's going to be the impacts of that? What these two maps are showing, especially the one on the right-hand side, the one on the left is showing rooftop temperature. So when we have a very hot day in the city of Chicago, this is your rooftop temperature. And what you can see is that there is not consistent community to community, census tract to census tract on who has the hottest temperatures. Okay? It is predominantly the south side and the west side that have the highest rooftop temperatures. When we think about vulnerability, socioeconomic vulnerability to extreme heat, that's the map that's shown on the right-hand side. And again, it's the west and the south sides of the city of Chicago, much more than the north side or along the lake coast, that have the highest vulnerability to extreme heat. All right? So this is essentially a predictor of impacts to communities. And if we assume that the entire city of Chicago, the risk of exposure to a heat wave is increasing consistently, what this is telling us is that the same neighborhoods that already have the biggest impacts from extreme heat or air quality are going to also face the largest impacts because they are more vulnerable to those sorts of hazards. Okay, so again, thinking about climate change is not just, it's a change in heat, it's a change in flooding, all these different things, but it exacerbates, it widens the inequities that are already built into our system. Okay, it worsens these sorts of things. Okay, I'll mention one of these sort of solutions is planting trees, right? We hear about planting trees all the time, green infrastructure, right, that sort of thing. And so the solution to exposure to extreme heat is planting trees. Well, there's a recent Tribune analysis that found that over the last 10 years, Chicago has planted trees at a much higher rate in wealthier and whiter neighborhoods over the past decade. And so even the solution of investment in green infrastructure in those neighborhoods has happened disproportionately in the neighborhoods that were already the least vulnerable to extreme heat. All right? So this is really important, is that it's what climate change will intersect with when it comes to solutions is how we've already built in inequalities in our system and how we address those inequalities to reduce the vulnerability of the most vulnerable. Okay, and I don't just want to pick on the city of Chicago. I mean, we can find this in pretty much any city or any moderate-sized town in Illinois and really in the country. Case in point here, taken from the area that I grew up in, the Peoria area. Same kind of projection here in our 5-day average, maximum temperature. It's going to get warmer. We're going to see more extreme heat. And on the right-hand side, what this is showing is census tract by census tract, kind of the vulnerability to extreme heat. There's a nice mapper here you can get with NOAA that shows census tract by census tract what your vulnerability is to changes in extreme heat. And what this is showing, the reason I kind of break this down is that you can see the change just in vulnerability, the significant change in vulnerability by going a very short distance. Is anybody from the Peoria area? Can't see. I'll familiarize those of you who aren't from there. Basically, the line here between the dark blue census tract and the lightish, tan, yellowish census tract, that's the Illinois River. And by doing the 10-minute walk over the Illinois River on the Murray-Baker Bridge, from Peoria to East Peoria, it takes you from a census tract that's in the 90th percentile of vulnerability to extreme heat. The whole country, not the state, the whole country, the 90th percentile of vulnerability to extreme heat takes you from there to one that's in the 10th percentile of extreme heat. All right? So what this is saying is that when we have an increase in extreme heat and an increase in temperatures in the Peoria area, as is projected and is what's been shown in the last 50 to 70 years, we'll have these disproportionate outcomes because it's built-in vulnerability. So I present this in a way to think about, yes, the impacts of climate change, mitigating climate change is extremely important insofar as we reduce emissions, reduce the overall change in temperature and precipitation impacts, but also at the same time, what adaptation means that we have to fix these existing inequalities so that we don't have the most vulnerable suffering these disproportionate consequences and impacts. I'm going long, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but of course it's not just in urban areas. In rural areas, we have a lot of vulnerable populations as well, and in some cases even more vulnerable populations in some of our poor rural areas in the state of Illinois. One group that's at a very high risk when it comes to extreme heat exposure are farm workers, especially migrant farm workers for specialty crops. And we should say that there's only 4 states in the union that have any kind of heat protection for farm workers, and that is Minnesota, California, Oregon, and Washington. So the lack of policy in many states, not just in Illinois, means that folks like migrant farm workers face significant issues when it comes to vulnerability to extreme heat. Okay, urban flooding is another one. When I talk about urban flooding, here's a picture from Gibson City. I think I mentioned that really, really bad flooding. This is a drone shot from Gibson City from last year. Really, really significant flooding. And again, none of the area you see here in this picture in the bottom left is in the 100-year floodplain. So it's very likely that few, if any, of those buildings, the residential structures, the commercial structures have flood insurance because they don't have to. Because they're not in a 100-year floodplain, because this wasn't riverine flooding. Riverine flooding is when you get lots of rain over a long period of time, and your small streams back up, your large rivers back up, and you get flooded in the floodplain. Well, when you build a floodplain, that's what happens. The floodplain is part of the river, right? It's not separated from that. This is urban flooding, and it's a lot less predictable, and it's a lot less easily mapped, which means a lot of people don't even know the risk they are at for urban flooding. Which makes it quite an insidious impact of climate change. And as our precipitation intensity increases, these types of events will also increase in frequency. Okay? And again, and unfortunately, just like when it comes to extreme heat, when we look at a city like Chicago, we have disproportionate impacts in the poorest parts of the city when it comes to urban flooding. Some statistics here, almost 90% of flood damage insurance claims since 2007 in the city of Chicago are paid in communities of color. And, by the way, the vast majority of flood claims in Illinois since 2000 have happened outside of the mapped 100-year floodplain. I should say part of that statistic is because we've done a really good job of mapping the floodplain, buying out structures, moving towns, doing the things we need to do to make ourselves less vulnerable to riverine flooding. But another part of it is the fact that we're seeing a really large increase in this kind of urban flooding. Yeah. Interestingly, the Water Survey did a study where we took that Gibson City storm. By the way, extreme rainfall, and there's no reason it happened in Gibson City. Right? There's nothing special about Gibson City. They had a really good German restaurant, and I hear it's going to open back up soon. But beyond that, there's really nothing special about Gibson City. It could have happened in Champaign-Urbana just as easily. So what this Water Survey group did is they took that storm and they said, what happens if that happened in Champaign-Urbana? And the results I can't even show. They won't let me show them because they have to be qualified. In fact, if this is a modeling study, because the results were really eye-popping. And the number of estimated casualties and fatalities, electrical power outage, is really nasty. So this is really some pretty significant stuff when it comes to urban flooding. In fact, I would suffice to say that I think urban flooding is probably the #1 climate change related issue that Illinois faces over the next 10 to 20 years. Not to say that extreme heat is not a problem, but I think this is really significant. Okay, last one that I want to talk about when it comes to impacts of severe weather. There's a lot of interest in tornadoes. How many of you have ever seen a tornado in person? Hopefully, oh wow, okay, great. Well, a lot of you from Illinois. Hopefully it didn't impact you directly, because they can be scary. Tornadoes are fascinating until there's one barreling down on you. That's my opinion. Anyway, what we've seen is an increase in tornado frequency since the 1980s in Illinois. Tornadoes are fairly hard to measure, much more so than precipitation and temperature. We have seen a significant increase. Anywhere you see here in red and yellow, that's where that increase has been. So all across the South, the Mid-South and Midwest. And projections from climate models, as error-prone as they are, do show a pretty consistent trend of increased thunderstorm day frequency. The climate models, they have a grid cell that's 100 kilometers. They can't model tornadoes. But what they can do is give you something like thunderstorm days, the probability of getting a thunderstorm. And that is projected to increase. I will say, though, is that when I get called by the media, when a big tornado happens, like what happened in Edwardsville or in Kentucky in December, big tornado happens, first thing happens, my phone rings, and say, hey, what's climate change got to do with this? And it just makes me pull my hair out. And it's like, you're focusing on the wrong thing. This small increase in tornado frequency does not equate to a significant increase in the risk of being exposed to a tornado. There's a much different factor at play, a much more important factor at play than changes in tornado frequency that's increasing our risk of tornado damage. And the big one is urban growth. Okay? So tornadoes don't happen, they're kind of like those extreme rainfall events. Tornadoes don't happen here but not here. All right? If you grew up in a small country town, you probably heard some kind of fable about why your town's never been hit by a tornado. I know I did. We have a 200-foot pile of dirt that came because it was a mining town in central Illinois. And that was keeping all the tornadoes away until one day an F4 rolled right through town. Right? So there's nothing that keeps a tornado away. The lakeshore, a lot of people think the lakeshore or the urban heat island effect keep tornadoes out of Chicago. No, they don't. The only reason that there hasn't been a tornado that has rolled through the loop is because we've gotten lucky. There hasn't been one. Okay? So when we see urban sprawl, suburban and moderate-sized cities, what it means is that it's putting more people at risk. It's more stuff for these tornadoes to hit. Case in point, we had an EF5 tornado roll through the Plainfield area in 1990. All right? It sat down in Oswego and then picked up right outside of downtown Joliet. And what I'm showing you here is that track of that 1990 tornado overlaid by the Google Earth image here from 1990. And what you can see is that pretty much across most of the tornado's path, it did not come in contact with much in the way of developed area. There was some development by Crystal Lawns and, of course, in Joliet, but by this time it wasn't an EF5 tornado, it was like an EF2. Okay? Now, if we were to overlay that tornado here onto the current, or at least 2020, sprawl, what we know about this area, Plainfield, Oswego, outside of Joliet, this area has gone from farmland to subdivisions and strip malls. Right? Anybody from that area, by the way? Yeah. It's amazing. You get development like Coal City now. It's like part of the city. I know it's not part of the city. My apologies to people who live in Chicago proper, but it's developed. And what this means is as we get this sprawl, our urban development areas, again, it's not just Chicago, it's all of our urban areas, what it means is more people are put at risk to be exposed to a tornado. So even without a change in the frequency of severe weather, we see an increase in the risk of impact from extreme weather just because of that sprawl. And then we come to the developments themselves, the buildings themselves. I'm kind of contrasting two different events here where we have two very, very different outcomes. Okay? The left is from my hometown in 2004 when that EF4 tornado rolled through. That's the Parsons manufacturing plant outside of Roanoke. We had about 250 people inside of that building on the left-hand side when that EF4 tornado rolled through and had 0 serious injuries. Somebody got some scratches on their arm, another person, and lots of people had some probably psychological damage from being scared, very badly. So 0 serious injuries, and the reason because is because a tornado event in the 1980s that the owner of the Parsons manufacturing plant was involved in scared that person enough that they put in state-of-the-art tornado shelters inside each of the bathrooms within their manufacturing plant about 5 or 6 years before that tornado rolled through. And they had a plan in place that they executed once a month if there was a tornado that was happening. So everybody knew what they were going to do, everybody knew who to check on who, and everybody was safe. Contrast that with what happened this last December in Edwardsville when we had EF3 tornado that hit part of an Amazon warehouse or distribution center. We had 6 people killed. Unfortunately, it was the first time since 2017 that we had a tornado-related fatality in the state of Illinois. Now, there's lots of ongoings with that event, so we can't say for sure exactly what happened, but from what it sounds like, there was a lot of confusion about what was going on, who was doing what. All right, so it's, again, the building codes are important, our plans in place are important, and they can make a lot more difference than any sort of small change in weather. I just like to make that contrast. Okay, last little bit here, and probably the only reason you came to this talk, other than getting extra credit from some people maybe, is the role of sustainable design and development. What is the goal here? What's the role of sustainable design? How does this play in? First and foremost, I've been throwing these words around a lot, so I should probably define them up front, but I'm going to do it now. Mitigation is essentially fixing the problem of climate change. It's addressing the root issue, which is greenhouse gas concentrations. So when we reduce greenhouse gas concentrations, we reduce the impact of climate change. Lots of different ways we do that, but if you remember that pie chart that I showed you about 6 hours ago, it showed you that the transportation, the electricity, the industry, that's where the majority of our emissions are coming from. All right? Climate change does not get fixed without mitigation. A lot of people like to focus on adaptation, extremely important, but it doesn't get fixed without mitigation. We absolutely have to eliminate our greenhouse gas emissions and have to do it probably in the next 30 years to reach those manageable points. Adaptation is saying, yes, we have climate change, we have it now, and even if we mitigate the effects of climate change, we're still going to experience impacts. We need to increase the resilience of our systems now so that we don't see as much vulnerability now and into the future. Both pieces are extremely important, and there's different ways of doing this, and you can see here from these different pieces that architecture, sustainable design fit in a lot of these. They really do. And that's kind of the argument I want to make, is that architecture plays a really important role in both mitigation and adaptation. Okay? When it comes to mitigation, the number one thing is energy efficiency. Okay? Now, I just saw a photo of a video of somebody driving an electric Hummer. Right? Anybody see this electric Hummer? It weighs like 12,000 pounds. It goes 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. If you ride your bike in a major city, it's like going to be the bane of your existence. But it's a really impressive vehicle. The problem is that it's extremely energy wasteful. And we like to focus on electrification of our transportation sector, right? EVs and this sort of thing happening. But in fact, the best way to mitigate climate change is just use less energy. We need to transfer to renewables as quickly as possible and get away from fossil fuel production. But in the meantime, using less energy solves our problem even faster. So energy efficiency is extremely important. One of the most important components, at least I would argue, for architecture climate change mitigation. I have this example here from this Bland's Full Circle. And this is taken in a dry climate. Obviously, we can't have vegetables produced year-round in Illinois unless you have a greenhouse or something like that. But basically, this is showing an example of sustainable design of a residential structure that takes into account the siting of it, the natural lighting, the angle of the sun, where you put, and again, my naivete is going to show through with architecture, but it's from the actual design of the structure to the materials that are used to build that structure to the landscape that surrounds the structure. Everything is thought and planned out with energy efficiency in mind. All right? And this is an important step to climate mitigation. All right? Even if the energy that this house uses to supplement its solar panel produced energy, even if that energy comes from coal-fired power plants, it's using less energy overall, which is an important step for mitigation. So again, energy efficiency, extremely important. Thinking about passive climate control systems, on-site water and energy recycling. So for example, when we take a nice hot shower, all of that hot wastewater is going through the pipes, recycling that energy to be used for the next round, the next shower. Those sorts of things are put in place so that again we're using overall less energy. A lot of what this takes is site analysis for your lighting, your water, your landscape, your building layout design. This is just one example of that. But energy efficiency, again, that's where it really starts, I think, when it comes to our building and infrastructure. And then what the buildings themselves are actually made out of. Obviously, recycled materials, you don't have the energy that's used to produce the raw material, the new material. Things like reclaimed wood, that's becoming so popular. Recycled rubber, old structures like steel structures, for example. And then for those that we can't recycle, rapid regenerative materials like bamboo, wheat straw, cork oak. These are plants and materials that can rapidly regenerate so that you don't have to, for example, cut down a mature oak stand that's not going to regenerate for another 50 or 60 years to create that housing development. And then a big thing I want to mention also is it's not just the recycling that's really important, but also the new materials that we do use have got to be high quality, long-lived materials. Pushing back on planned obsolescence. How many of you heard of planned obsolescence before? Good, okay. Anybody have a good example of planned obsolescence? Yeah, way in the back. Yeah, right here. I'll tell you, this is 4 years old, and I'm going to take him out 4 years. I swear. This is my advertisement for the Motorola company. Yes, I'm an Android user, and I'll take that to my grave. And the planned obsolescence means that every 2 years your phone battery is so crappy that you can't use it, or Apple comes out with a new little plug-in device that makes yours obsolete, or you need memory storage, or the camera just looks cool. That's planned obsolescence. Every time we produce something like an electronic good or housing structures, for example, that are planned to only last 1 or 2 years for a cell phone or 10 or 20 years for these structures, it means that they have to be replaced with new materials for that. And so pushing back on that is really important so that when we're building structures, we're using those new materials, they have a 50 or 75-year, 100-year lifetime as opposed to a 10 to 20-year lifetime. And again, that all goes back to just energy efficiency. Okay, think about climate adaptation. This really goes to climate resilience, which is the text that's hidden behind the floating control here. Lots of different examples of this. Basically what this comes down to is design that reduces your vulnerability to the threats that we already face from climate change. So when we think about in Illinois, that's heat and that's flooding primarily. Okay, lots of examples of this. One, I'm just taking here's Central Wharf Plaza in Boston. This is a green space. Of course, we talk about green space and green infrastructure a lot. This is a green space that can act as a cooling place and on a very hot day in the city of Boston. And underneath all of that neat brickwork are a really sophisticated water management structure. So when we get stormwater drainage off of these developed impervious surfaces surrounding this area, it's funneled through this structure. And what it does is it not only stops that burst of stormwater, which then fills up our ditches, which then fills up our storm sewers and things like that, backs them up, creates urban flooding. It stops that burst of stormwater to reduce the effect of urban flooding. But the plants and the root systems that are planted there are specifically chosen to also help pull out a lot of the runoff and the nutrients, the stuff we don't want in our water, basically essentially improving water quality of that as well. So this is a good example of an adaptive design for a kind of a city center or small park, so that it can overall reduce the effects of changes in extreme heat and changes in flooding. Just real important, this doesn't actually do anything to fight changing climate. What it does is it just makes us less vulnerable to those impacts. Another good example here is water management design. I call this blue infrastructure. So this is on the right-hand side is the bioswale in St. Louis. It's not all that pretty, and the coneflower is pretty, but everything else is kind of planned there. But what this is doing is it's funneling in runoff from those adjacent parking lots and developed areas. So that if we get a really intense rainfall event, by the way, like we got in St. Louis this year, right? Instead of all of that water running off these impervious surfaces into a stormwater drainage system that's woefully undersized, instead what this bioswale will do is slow that burst of runoff and stormwater drainage. And it can make a significant impact, especially at scale. This is one example, but at scale, make a significant impact to the reducing flood vulnerability in our urban areas. Another good one when I talk to individuals and residential users are rain barrels. Rain barrels can be a great way, simple way to reduce overall vulnerability to flooding and drought. So of course, as a residential user, you get that runoff off of your roof system, and funneling that into a large rain barrel again reduces the runoff of that water off of your own residential property. And, by the way, once that really intense rainfall event's done, you go dry again, you have that rain to use for your plants, so you don't have to use pumps for water to get water to your house, which uses energy to water your plants. So it's again, it all goes back to energy efficiency, but these are just examples of resilience as well, and climate resilience. And then the last part here is really about, I'm going to take the controls off here, is really about collaboration with sustainable and urban rural design. You probably can't read some of the small text here. It's not really meant to read. But basically what this is from the DOE, and this is just an example, showing several examples of essentially smart, climate-resilient urban design. And so this point is just to make that a lot of the examples that I showed really here as far as the mitigation, the adaptation potential of architecture is, of course, in line with a broader scale or broader scope of climate-resilient urban design. And so, of course, it's the built infrastructure that is really important, but it's also our transportation infrastructure, our green infrastructure. All of these things work in unison. So, in fact, we have urban planning, by the way, in the School of Architecture. And urban planning is in the School of Architecture. Is that right? Did I get that right? Okay, good. Sort of, okay. Dotted line. Then well, the collaboration between urban planners and architects is really, really important in building an overall energy resilient city. Okay, so with that, the kind of, I focused a lot on our built environments, so I kind of took pictures from our more beautiful natural environments across Illinois for this. As concluding thoughts here, the impacts of climate change, the significant impacts to the state of Illinois. And again, it's much broader than that when we think about global impacts. But there is a really important role when it comes to architecture, when it comes to building design, when it comes to systems design, for both mitigation and adaptation to those impacts. And so, hopefully this is helpful to kind of frame overall climate change and the way that architecture fits in with climate change. And with that, John, I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody has. Discussion, thanks.